This video has been brought to you by supporters on Patreon. Hello. This is my son. I gave birth to him over 57 grueling hours of labor. So beginning at around 9 years old, I had a hyperfixation with Sonic the Hedgehog. It was terminal. The doctor said I had only 3 weeks to live. And this hyperfixation lasted well into mid-high school. So for some vaguely concrete years for said hyperfixation, it started roughly in 2002 after finding Sonic 3 and Knuckles collection in a Kmart, and lasted until either 2010 or 2011, and gradually tapered off from there. And I graduated high school in 2012. Anyway, I was not only into the games, but also the comics, cartoons, all of it. Seriously, here is a mountain of my own Sonic slop just to emphasize how far down the Sonic hole I was. And the further I got into my teenage years, the more embarrassed I got about said hyperfixation. And I also started to feel maybe just a little too old for the games, especially as I felt, at least at the time, that the writing for the games seemed to get increasingly juvenile and progressively target a younger demographic, beginning with Sonic Unleashed and later with Sonic Colors. Because of that, I gravitated more toward the post-Ken Penders, Ian Flynn-helmed Archie comics, because 15 and 16-year-old me thought that these comics, at least compared to the games, felt a bit more mature and attempted to provide actual character depth and growth for the entire Sonic cast. I would like to once again emphasize that these were my feelings as a teen. As an adult, I think the writing for the games are generally pretty atrocious. Though Kid Me was right in the sense that the games certainly get less edgy after Sonic 06, and very silly after Ken Pontac and Warren Graff take over as head writers during the 2010s. I do, however, think that a lot of the Ian Flynn written Archie comics are actually pretty solid, especially the later story arcs, just before the Sonic rug is pulled out from under Archie comics. Now, over the entire course of this hyperfixation, one desire remains strong and consistent. And that was to see a theatrical Sonic the Hedgehog movie. However, the best I could get while growing up was the Sonic OVA, as well as rumors of films and fan films, which included their own respective rotten sludge piles of toxic internet drama. So let's fast forward to the time of the first Sonic movie's release. I was a post-college adult who really only had a nostalgic attachment to the Sonic the Hedgehog character, followed by a very nerdy academic interest in seeing how the movie would turn out in terms of quality, as well as how it would perform financially in response to its absolutely wretched public reception to Sonic's revolting initial character design. My interest in the project grew even more after hearing about the studio's decision to revamp the character design and hire on animator and Sonic ambassador Tyson Hesse as a consultant. I remember seeing Tyson's sprite art and his comics on Sonic Fansites back in the day, so it was kind of surreal for me to learn that he was hired on to help steer the Sonic movie in some capacity. So this brings us to what I thought about the first two Sonic movies. I thought Sonic 1 was just okay. It was a pretty standard buddy cop movie, but this time with a furry creature that was slightly elevated by Jim Carrey being Jim Carrey, who also seemed to really enjoy the role, probably because it allowed him to have a ton of freedom in terms of performing physical comedy and improv. More than anything, I was very impressed and very surprised that the studio decided to make the unprecedented decision to change the character design after public backlash, as well as mildly punch up the script. In terms of my thoughts on Sonic 2, I thought it was much stronger overall, and had a greater focus on the core Sonic characters, and it did a better job at leaning into the weirdness of the concept, as well as incorporating more of what worked about the games. I thought Idris Elba's performance as Knuckles was great, which, in conjunction with Casey, Miller, and Whittington's writing choices, is one of my favorite interpretations of the character. I know a big portion of Movie Knuckles' character is fish out of water comedy, but I'm fine with that honestly. I think it's endearing and works well for the character. On the other hand, I thought Tails was extremely underwritten, undercharacterized, and majorly sidelined in favor of Knuckles and the rest of the cast. This sidelining problem reaches critical mass when all Sonic characters completely disappear for a while in favor of a human wedding subplot that feels like a bad SNL skit. On a related note, I also wasn't generally a huge fan of Sonic 2's brand of comedy. I mostly found it to be pretty grating. I know I'm one to talk, since I know a number of you think my dogshit humor is insufferable. But good news, that shit's not going away. Hell is real, and I created it just for you. Now finally, what did I think of Sonic 3? Honestly, I think it's the best of the Sonic movie bunch overall, with some pretty major caveats. One of the most enjoyable parts of these movies for me, not only on an academic level, but also as someone who used to be a walking dumpster full of Sonic the Hedgehog lore, is seeing how characters and storylines are adapted from the games to both work within the Sonic movie universe and build off of what has already been established in previous movies. And with that in mind, I think Sonic 3 has the strongest character writing and the strongest performances in the entire series. Setting up Sonic as a character who is the near opposite of Shadow in terms of how human conduct and human connection shape their identity is, I feel, a great choice. As is establishing that Sonic is unable to understand Shadow or alter Shadow's character growth until Sonic experiences the near loss of the person who not only helps Sonic find a home, but also helps Sonic form his current identity. Additionally, I think that Sonic 3 is the best that Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles have ever been written, and I really appreciate how they feel more like siblings, especially siblings who have a solid chemistry with one another. Now, I don't think it's on the level of chemistry as, say, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, but it works for me. Sonic, Knuckles, and Tails bond, squabble, compete, support each other, and grow together. To help illustrate the sibling dynamic, there is a really solid scene near the end of the second act where Sonic is flooded with anger and resentment at Shadow from leaving Tom in critical condition. Sonic therefore wants to go super to destroy Shadow. In response, Knuckles basically big brothers Sonic in an attempt to dissuade him from making a destructive decision. Knuckles eventually gives in to Sonic's resolve, trusting that Sonic will make the right decision in the end. I'm probably overstating it, but the sibling dynamic really works for me. This movie also has a really good balance of the three primary Sonic characters in terms of character screen time and involvement in the story, which was a major problem that I had with the second movie, as mentioned earlier. I think the combination of these choices all do a lot to help connect general audiences to these silly furry creatures. I also think that these are the best Jim Carrey performances out of the entire trilogy. Jim Carrey plays both Robotnik and his grandfather Gerald, and both characters interact so convincingly that you forget that they're the same actor. Like, this is not just Jim Carrey in a room speaking to Jim Carrey. He is performing a ton of physical comedy with himself, including dancing and fighting with himself. It is probably some of the most effective actor duplication techniques that I have ever seen. Additionally, I think the scenes with Shadow and Maria are very well executed, and probably the best bits of the entire movie. I also like Maria's characterization quite a bit. She's playful and has an appropriately childlike sense of humor, and though brief, you get a pretty good sense of Maria and Shadow's bond, as well as how she impacts Shadow's personality, sense of humor, and his patterns of thought. I wish there were at least 5 to 10 minutes more of these flashback scenes to further flesh out Maria's character, Shadow and Maria's relationship, and especially Maria and Gerald's relationship. Maria is supposedly Gerald's primary and only motivation for destroying the Earth, but they have almost no screen time together. Aside from the Maria death scene, where Gerald is trying to escape the gun research base with Shadow and Maria. But maybe these scenes could be fleshed out retroactively in either a Paramount Plus miniseries or a spin-off movie. Now with that said, I think what Sonic 3 delivers as is in these flashback scenes is effective enough to establish Shadow's character and communicate his motivation for a general audience. Additionally, I've seen disagreements on Keanu Reeves' performance in this movie, but I think Keanu's sort of stilted, labored, and slow-paced way of speaking really works for Shadow's character. I think Keanu's voice and performance convey the pain and misanthropy of Shadow's character very well. Now, on the topic of Shadow and Maria, let's get the elephant-sized gunshot wound out of the room. I'm sure this will sound absolutely pathological to anyone who isn't familiar with 2000s era Sonic, But, unfortunately, Maria is not gunned down by the US military, nor does the movie feature a video recording of Gerald Robotnik dying by firing squad. She of course does die though, as does Gerald, though in the former's case it's from an explosion triggered by a misfired gunshot, rather than a direct, calculated gunshot. In Gerald's case, it's, Moving on, I think that the action sequences are the most fun and creative in the entire Sonic movie series. But, just like the flashback scenes, they're also extremely brief. Included in especially the later action sequences are some gorgeous extreme wide shots that also show a great sense of scale, like a shot that shows Super Sonic and Super Shadow's tiny golden trails next to the size of the moon, as well as a beautiful shot where Sonic destroys the Parthenon and punches Shadow all the way to the moon. Now, I imagine these effects-heavy scenes were kept brief for budgetary reasons, as the film has a very modest budget of around $122 million. For comparison, most modern blockbuster movies are in the $200 million range. I'm honestly really impressed by just how good this movie's effects look in relation to how small the budget is. In an age with progressively ballooning Hollywood budgets, it's really refreshing to encounter a movie with a line producer and/or production accountant who at least seems to have a really good sense of how much things cost, and therefore is able to smartly allocate production resources to keep things relatively economical. Alright, buckle up. Here come my issues with the movie. Now this might sound weird to a number of you, but I honestly think the movie has some severe tonal issues. The movie can get excessively silly, which undermines the impact of some of the more serious moments of the movie for me. In this same movie, you have a character who is repeatedly reliving the brutal death of a child, and Jim Carrey repeatedly spanking Jim Carrey with a giant CG hand. I think both of these scenes work fine in a vacuum, as in independently of one another, but combined, it feels more like they smashed two separate movies together that were trying to achieve disparate goals in terms of what they were trying to communicate to the audience. With tone in mind, I'm not sure if Shadow or Maria necessarily work within the same world as Gerald Robotnik's over-the-top silly character and performance. Now please don't misinterpret me, I'm not saying the movie can't be silly. I'm very aware that these are movies featuring talking cartoon animals beating the shit out of each other, so an amount of silliness is par for the course. But I think the movie too often skews way too far into absurdity and frequently undercuts serious moments with jokes and bits, which for me sort of takes the legs out from under the effectiveness of, say, Shadow and Maria's flashback scenes, or Sonic's character arc that catalyzes as a result of Tom's uncertain death. Additionally, the pacing, especially in the first act, felt jarringly fast to me, to the degree that portions of the movie gave me the impression that scenes or parts of scenes were left on the cutting room floor. Especially with respect to Kristen Ritter's character, whose role and motivation felt extremely underdeveloped and unclear, and she completely disappears after the second act. I also got the impression that more Shadow and Gerald flashback scenes were cut for time, but I could be wrong on that front. If anything, I imagine that the pace is ultimately the way it is to conserve as much budget as possible to include story elements that the writer and directors felt were crucial, especially considering how massively CG heavy and effects heavy the movie is. So ultimately, in spite of my issues with its tone, I still really enjoyed the movie as a whole. And I was honestly impressed by how much of the movie they were able to make work on a narrative level. The Sonic movies are also some of the closest I felt to being a kid again, Sonic 3 being no exception. Additionally, experiencing the reactions of the audience to certain scenes or certain character reveals honestly brings me so much life. Like, people lost their minds with the 1-2 punch of revealing Metal Sonic followed by Amy. I even overheard a couple parents explaining the lore of the games to their kids after the movie ended. It felt really validating to kid me who was really embarrassed about being into this stuff. Anyway, what were your thoughts on Sonic 3? Did you love it, hate it, find it mediocre? Sound off in the comments below. If you liked this video, please make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to see new videos and updates the second they release. This also massively helps the channel grow. Additionally, I'd like to give a huge, massive thank you to Shivering Pixel patrons Mr. Badger, Scotty Scotties, and Keontae. If you would like to support what I do, as well as have your name read aloud on each and every new video, or get videos 1 week ahead of time, as well as receive a whole host of exclusive stuff, you can head over to patreon.com/shiveringpixel. Once again, that is patreon.com/shiveringpixel.